end of our conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. Is it okay if I call you Jason?
Yeah, of course.
And you are the director of the Center for the Blue Economy, which is based at the Middlebury Institute. Talk really quickly, just a little bit about your job. I know we could spend all evening talking about your job, but a quick, say we're in an elevator. Give me an elevator pitch of what the Center for the Blue Economy is.
Yeah, sure. We basically examine the economic contributions of the oceans and coasts to the global economy and are figuring out ways to make our relationship with the ocean sustainable. And so the new industries and kind of new sectors for the 21st century.
And you were one of the contributors. I think there's four or five authors included on this report that is newly published from the Economist Group World Ocean Initiative. Are
Yes,
these
correct.
peers that you talk to all the time, or do you have a group text that you share and stuff with them, or is it brought together for special projects like this?
Yeah, so The Economist basically interviewed all of us separately. Michael Conathan is actually on the advisory council for the center, and I know him quite well. I've worked with him for about 10 years. I know of the other people, but I did not actually converse with them. Yeah, they kind of interviewed us all and put this all together. It wasn't kind of a joint project.
It's an amazingly forward-thinking, aspirational report and a document. As going through it and reading it, so many things are in there: hurdles, obstacles, potentials. This is where we need to do more research and development. Is this to get? Do you want people who read this report to get inspired for things that they can do, or to be like, "Oh my gosh, this is too much work. I never should have gone down this blue economy road in the first place."
Well, I mean, anyone who's working in the climate space, is used to being overwhelmed. It's an overwhelming reality. But no, again, I think the economist folks really wanted it to be, opportunities, right? I mean, there's a kind of old joke about environmentalists. What do they say yes to, right? Because so much of the environmental movement is oppositional. And there's some good reasons for that. We don't want more offshore oil drilling and stuff like that because it's polluting and destructive, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we have to have an affirmative vision. And I think that's what this Economist report was trying to put forward.
There's four things that are outlined in the report: clean energy, transport emissions, food systems, and then carbon dioxide removal and storing in the ocean. The first thing I want to ask you a little bit about is this idea of carbon storing. That, in some ways, the most difficult concept. What do you mean by carbon storing, specifically with the ocean?
Yeah. Yeah, so real quick, I want to say I did not work on this piece of the report specifically, but I do know a lot about it, and so I do want to comment on that.
Yeah.
So the first thing is the oceans are already the biggest sink or absorber or sequesterer of carbon dioxide in the world. So about half of all the carbon that we've emitted through fossil fuel burning is being absorbed in the oceans. The problem is it's acidifying the oceans, and that's where we get ocean acidification, which is all the creatures that have shells and calcified kind of components of their bodies they're eroding, and those creatures are at the bottom of a lot of food chains, right? So ocean acidification is a really bad thing. That being said, there are some scientists who are thinking that the ocean is getting pretty saturated, and we might have to figure out new ways apart from the kind of natural processes to absorb some carbon if we can't cut emissions down. Now, the key thing to remember here is we want to cut emissions, but if we can't, we got to figure out somewhere for them to go that's not the atmosphere. And so some people are trying to suck them out of the air and inject them underground. Some people are looking into the oceans. There's a lot of controversy over this. I'm not a huge proponent of this, to be honest. I think there's a lot of dangers. Again, the ocean already is largely saturated. There's huge disruptions to the food web. There's things as far out. It's basically geoengineering of the ocean in a small and or larger scale. And so there's things of like seeding the oceans with iron that absorb carbon dioxide and then float to the bottom of the ocean and store it permanently or at least for long periods of time. So I'm not an expert on exactly the specifics of this. I'm not opposed to kind of test projects or research because, hey, let's just see what's out there. But I think we got to be very cautious before we start using the oceans in a big geoengineering scheme.
It sounds like a little bit of like terraforming our planet for what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah, in some roundabout way, I would think that's true. Now, again, also the thing about carbon sequestration, out of the taking it out of the air, is it's expensive. Like taking it out of the air and injecting it underground is expensive. If we could get that cheap, that might not be that bad, right? If we could put the carbon dioxide in a kind of liquid form or a foam or something like that form back where we took all the oil out of in the first place, there's a lot of seismic activity in the world now because we've left these huge open pockets where all this oil used to be for hundreds of millions of years. We could fill that back up, probably stabilize the earth a little, and less seismic activity probably be nice. And again, I'm not really worried about carbon dioxide in big underground caverns, but ocean, yeah, probably let's be cautious about that.
This was, speaking of sort of the terraforming and science fictional, one of these things that's in the report is um, algae derived biofuel. That sounds like something I would read, in a Samuel R. Delany or Octavia E. Butler novel. Like we're relying on this algae derived biofuel. Is that a part that you were thinking about for this report?
Yeah, yeah. So algae biofuels is actually not new. This is actually, so a lot of these things are not new technologies. They're just kind of gaining in prominence, and the technology is accelerating. So algae is it's a very efficient life form, and it grows really quick. It grows basically, it's photosynthesis. It's a little solar panels, right? Like all plants, but these are really kind of micro versions that grow at scale, and then they're pretty easy to convert into fuel. Again, though, it's to get it at the appropriate scale, the processing and everything to do it cheap enough to make it cost competitive with other types of fuels. But it's incredibly, it's carbon neutral in the sense that, it's just absorbing carbon from the air and then releasing it. You're not releasing stuff that's underground, right? So it's carbon neutral in that sense. And it's also, the emissions are much less polluting than oil or coal or something, or even natural gas, because it's just plant material that's very kind of simple. So I think this has great potential. I think I'm a big believer in all the kind of low trophic level plant based solutions, and so I think what these need is some more R&D. We're throwing around trillions of dollars in this pandemic and post pandemic economy. And so the key is, let's throw some billions at R&D for things like this and see if we can get at least some demonstration projects up at scale.
This Economist Group report could land on a policymaker's desk. They'll read it. They'll be like, "Oh, this is amazing. This sounds really great," and then they might hear an idea for some legislation or a regulation that comes their way, and that could be how they activate some of this information. Is that what you're hoping will happen?
Yeah, well, and it's already happening. So some of this stuff that we've been advocating for was just in the bill that President Biden signed yesterday, the bipartisan infrastructure framework. There's money for ports, electrifying ports, greening shipping. There's money from everything from wildlife corridors. There's money for more renewable energy technology, for electric charging stations. So that's in it. The big stuff, though, is in the Build Back Better bill, which the Democrats are negotiating right now, and there's a lot of stuff in there that basically parallel to the Economist report. So it's already happening, and that was the goal, and we're very happy that Biden administration is taking this stuff seriously. Ultimately, the goal was to get ocean climate at the front burner in people's consciousness, so that it's not a side issue, that people look to the oceans as kind of solutions for the climate emergency. And and that, as long as that has been achieved, which I think it has, I think we're on the right trajectory.
Real quick, I heard a story on NPR. I believe I was listening on the bill signing day, and about climate change and climate crisis mitigation money that's in there. This is a down payment. People are looking at
Yes.
this. This is the first step along what could
Yeah.
be years and years and years of policy and funding into the future.
Yes, I mean, the way to think about it is, this bill is, I think it's about over 8 years. It has about $500 billion of new funding. Most of that is not for climate stuff. It's for stuff that's important. It's getting broadband into rural areas. There's, I think, 60, 70 billion for replacing lead pipes, and that's, again, it's neurotoxin, the Center for Disease Control. The acceptable level of lead is zero. So, we need that out of the systems. The fact that it's 2021 and we still have lead pipes is kind of a travesty, but but there's money in it for real good stuff. And then, of course, roads, bridges, airports, the good stuff for to get the economy. And by the way, it will help the supply chain issues. People are worried, oh, we're spending money on, that's going to be more inflation. No, it's exact opposite. These are long-term investments that will actually ease inflationary pressures because we need modern infrastructure, right? So again, the critics of this have it exactly backwards. But the Build Back Better bill has about 600 billion specifically for climate stuff over 10 years again. And this is something people lose. We're not talking this in 1 year. It's over 10 years. And so when you're looking at inflation numbers for a few months, that shouldn't influence what you're doing on a 10-year project, right? Especially the last point I want to make, and it's very important, the big price volatility right now that's driving inflation is oil prices, gas prices. These are established on the world market. Any President Trump, Obama, Biden has very little control over the world price of gasoline and oil. But we do have the opportunity is to electrify our grid and then have it come from solar and wind, and that decreases price volatility. So if you don't want to be at the mercy of Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia for your gas prices, the Build Back Better is exactly what you want. You want an electrified system where we're getting U.S. resources that are stable and low cost permanently, right? If you have an electric car set up to a solar grid, you're not going to have to worry about energy price inflation, right? So I just want to make that point because that's very important. And a lot of this could be generated from offshore wind. So the Biden administration has a target 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That was a big thing we were pushing for. And a lot of that wind can power electric cars. So the wind's blowing off the coast, you're charging your car, you don't have to worry about Saudi Arabia. That's a much better, more stable America than the one we're currently living.
And this wind power and tide power and wave energy generation, that's all also discussed a bit in this report as well. There's a
Absolutely.
quote from you. There's a quote
Yeah,
from you in there. In the next stage, there will be a focus on environmental and social justice. There is going to be a lot of attention on employment impacts, community development, and equity. Talk a
yes.
little bit about those ideas, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk about it in a couple ways. So first of all, there's a lot of criticisms of the renewable energy sector, saying, a lot of these aren't union jobs. And hey, if I lose my job in the oil sector, that was a good union job. And am I going to get a $20 an hour contracting job for solar? So I'll say 2 points on that. First of all, that's a legitimate critique. Of all the critiques of renewable energy industry, that one is legitimate on one point. That the new jobs coming in renewables, we do need them to be living wage or union jobs. And the Biden administration is putting provisions in the bills to really push for that. Where some of the critics are wrong is the reality is the fossil fuel industry doesn't employ as many people as they claim. The people who are working it are getting good paying jobs, but it's not like, it's not tens of millions of jobs, whereas the remaking of the entire energy system in the US could be a lot more jobs. But I think, again, it's a fair point that it needs to be, good paying jobs with benefits. And that's part of what I mean by, this kind of just transition. The other part is really on the kind of climate mitigation and adaptation impacts at the local level. So if communities are facing storms and having to, rethink their boundaries and move communities around, as people know, in America, oftentimes it's the rich who have the money and the lawyers to work the system to get the federal funds and to bend the zoning laws and the local governments to their will, and the poor people can get left out. And so that's going to be really important that doesn't happen, right? That the money doesn't get siphoned off to the rich homeowners and landowners and businesses, but is equitably distributed. And the final point I'll make, on offshore wind is something we're very bullish on. There are going to be some impacts to other uses in the ocean, particularly fisheries. A lot of commercial fishing groups are opposed to offshore winds, and they make both good faith and bad faith arguments. Obviously, the bad faith arguments, we want to get out of the conversation, but the good faith arguments of, hey, is this going to impact our livelihoods? We have to do this right? We either have to put these offshore wind projects in areas that aren't going to negatively impact them, or we have to compensate them, or maybe even build in some structures where sometimes the pylons and the offshore wind can be a place that are reefs and they attract fish and that actually benefit fishing industry. So there are legitimate critiques on all of these dimensions that I think the equity piece has to be considered pretty full.
The report is so clear to say this is what could happen. We need to figure out the best way to make this happen, and we need to make it happen that it is not hurting anybody, but it's improving the lives of people like that. Are you proud of the report? Do you look at it and say that's some good work that they pulled together? I really agree with some of those conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I want to be clear here. It was the Economist Group that really wrote. I didn't write any of the
Right.
report. I was just interviewed for it. So I want to be clear about kind of attribution. But yeah, no, this is the second report that they've interviewed me for. The Economist, I'd say 90% of the time I agree with them. And I think, especially when they focus on this the pure kind of economics, sometimes when they do political commentary, they veer center right and get wrapped up in some nonsense. But when they focus on, just straight kind of economic analysis like this report, I think The Economist is fantastic. I love this report. And what it really shows is that the work that we have all done of these last few years to really elevate kind of ocean climate as a sector, as an industry, as a topic, as a piece of the climate puzzle has really hit the mainstream, and that was the goal.
Two more questions for you. The first is after coming out of COP26, the thing that I've heard so many people talk about, including Alice McGowan, who I know that you know as an international environmental policy. She is wonderful. I love talking with her. I think she's great. Keep 1.5 alive. Can we keep 1.5 alive going forward as a human race?
Yeah. So look, I mean, here there's a couple of things people need to understand about these targets or anything, right? You know, every tenth of a degree matters. And again, for the lay audience, I know that's hard to understand, but like we're talking about, thinking about massive migration, wildfire, drought, sea level rise, glacier melt, species extinction, ocean acidification. So every little piece on the dial matters. So that's the first thing. There's never going to get to a point where we just say, oh, we're over the line, too bad, right? Because if it's 1 degree over the line or 5 degrees over the line, that's a big difference. We are certainly in the range right now, the trajectory where life on Earth for even people alive today of our age, but definitely the youth, and it can be really challenging. What people don't get is exponential growth. It's a hard thing for people to understand, right? People have a hard time understanding it in terms of retirement accounts. They have a hard time understanding with climate change. Exponential curves go like this, right? They go slowly, 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 and then they hit an inflection point and they rocket up. We're at that inflection point. So everything you're seeing right now, the wildfires, the storms, it's about to ramp up like 10x, and then and keep ramping up for the rest of the century. So just imagine that, and imagine if the temperature is getting so hot, and many people for months out of the year, it will be unhealthy to be outside. 110, 120 degrees, right? People just dropping like flies, walking city streets. This is not a sustainable pathway. The last point I'll make here on that is, and I know, and I'll answer your question is, think about America. We're flipping out because a couple 100,000 people are trying to cross the border from Central America. Climate refugees, it's going to be millions, hundreds of millions, trying to pour in from those tropical latitudes up into the temperate and down to the temperate in South America. So if you think immigration and the cultural resentment and the right wing kind of proto fascism that's right now is bad, imagine 10x, 100x, right? So these are force multipliers. Coming back to answer your question, we absolutely still can do it. It's a matter of political will. Can we, as a civil society, as a body politic, transition our economy to a more green, blue, sustainable economy? The engineering is doable. It's just a big political project, and it's TBD, right? We will see.
The last thing is the ocean. We are the big blue marble, as I learned in school. From space, we look like a blue, lovely jewel. Shouldn't the ocean be bringing people together in a way that other things can't? And can you be a part of that unifying force of humanity through work with the ocean?
Yeah, yeah. As a colleague of mine, Jay Nichols, he's the author of Blue Mind. He's kind of popularized this concept of blue mind. And it's basically about how water and proximity to water is good for human health and emotional health, physical, mental. And I think that is absolutely right. And he points out, and he's not alone, right, that many people's fondest memories are at the beach or at the lake or at the river, or at the watering hole. It's where we honeymoon, we go to tropical beaches. It's where people think of retiring, right? I mean, it's certainly coastal environments and water-based environments are really looked at as kind of apex of human fulfillment and enjoyment and relaxation. And I don't think it's just cultural; it's physiological, right? We feel better looking out at a nice blue horizon and hearing the waves and the water lap up on the shore. So yes, I do think it is. The problem is the kind of the other side of this is it's a kind of out of sight, out of mind, right? You can look out at that blue and everything can be dead underneath it, right? And you might not know that, right? There's not many people who go scuba diving. There's not many people who know the creatures that live there. We kind of know whales and dolphins, right? But we have a pretty superficial knowledge. So yes, at the superficial level, it's absolutely unifying. At a deeper level, it's still a little opaque for a lot of people, and I think it's still, and that's why all the attempts from movies and National Geographic and to kind of and even to some extent aquariums to make people aware of the biodiversity that's in the oceans. Again, the joke that we know more about the surface of the moon than about the deep sea, right? And it's just still really an unknown environment that most people don't fully appreciate. But I think that is changing, and that's absolutely a good thing.
Thank you so much, Jason. Always great to talk with you. And
My
keep on
pleasure,
doing the
Andrew.
great
Thank
work
you.
that you're doing to save our planet and to make it more healthy, productive, and equitable for all people.
Thank you.